Hello, welcome back to Teen Story Share. This week we're continuing Silver in the Blood by Jessica Day George. I will put the last 2 weeks of reading in the links down below in case you didn't catch those. So when we last left, Lou and Dacia and Aunt Kate were traveling towards Bucharest, and they just had a rather strange encounter on the train. And meanwhile, Lou is in Paris with her parents on the way to Bucharest also, and she's being followed around the city by a strange man. So we're going to find out what happens next. The Diary of Miss Dacia Vreeholt, 4th of May, 1897. The ship from London to Greece was deathly boring. The train from Greece to Romania, Bucharest to be exact, was grimy yet interesting. But the last few days, shut in this house with no callers and no one to talk to but the servants, were truly awful. I thought that I was brought here to get close to my mother's family, yet the only member in evidence is Aunt Kate. I have known Aunt Kate all my life, and she is therefore not all that interesting to me. Unless she continues to have secret trysts with strange men, in which case she becomes very interesting, but not much of a role model for a young lady of my tender years. My disgraceful behavior in England was only a ruse after all, and Lord Johnny explained it all very well. It wasn't as though a marriage announcement appeared in the papers or any such thing. Must I be exiled because of it? I say no. I shall now test the bonds of my captivity. More later, if there's time. Calea Victoriae. Dacia, where do you think you're going? Looking down at her lavender and white striped walking gown with its eyelet lace trim, and then back at her aunt with an assumed expression of utmost innocence, Dacia shrugged her shoulders. Why, out shopping, of course, Aunt Kate. Do you need anything? Some ribbons, perhaps? Aunt Kate didn't even bother to argue with her, just stood in the hallway looking impeccable as always, in a morning gown of dove gray. She didn't sigh, didn't speak, just looked. Dacia knew that the best way to prove to her aunt that she was mature and in control was to remain silent and simply look back, but she never could. She stayed still for all of 2 seconds before she began her one-sided argument. I can hardly get into trouble. I don't know anyone here, and I'll take a footman with me, a large, burly footman. I have my own pin money, and I'll be back by lunchtime. Just please let me go, Aunt Kate. I haven't been anywhere by myself in weeks and weeks, and I just can't stay in this house another minute. Steely-eyed, Aunt Kate just looked. Irritated, restless, and several other emotions she could not accurately describe, Dacia looked back. She was just moments away from tearing off her walking gown and sliding down the banisters in her underthings, whooping like a savage, but she fought that urge with an effort. Instead, she played dirty. Very well, Aunt Kate. I suppose I shall just go up to my room and write a letter to my mother. Perhaps she will be able to tell me who it was that you were embracing on the back of our train that night. She turned slowly and put her hand on the doorknob of her bedroom. Oh, take 2 footmen and get me some blue ribbons for my striped poplin, you terrible child, Aunt Kate said. Then she disappeared back into her own room. Dacia couldn't believe that her ploy had worked, and simply stared at her aunt's door for half a minute. Then she really did whoop like a savage and ran down the stairs so fast that she might as well have slid on the banister. She already had her hat on and her purse dangling from her wrist. All that remained was to find a pair of footmen to accompany her, and that was easily done. There was one right there in the entrance hall, staring at her. She quickly told him to find a friend and come along, and went out on the front steps to wait while she put on her gloves. The sun was shining and it was pleasantly warm. She smoothed her gloves a final time and then unfurled her parasol. An entire city awaited her, and she could hardly wait to walk its streets. Even the view from her bedroom window had been enticing. The Calea Victoriae, where her family's townhouse was located, was the most prosperous street in Bucharest. Every house, including their own, was enormous and gorgeously appointed, with carved cornices and elegantly draped windows, manicured lawns, and lush gardens. All her life it had been the same routine, New York City society, with its same old families in their old houses, having their old parties, enlivened only slightly in the summer with a trip to Newport, where one stayed at the same hotel with the same families and the same parties once again, but at least there was sunshine and the shore to walk along. Lou never seemed to understand, but to Dacia the old routine was not remotely comforting. Instead, it was becoming more and more stifling, and Dacia perpetually felt as though there was something fighting within her chest, ready to burst out. She wanted to run and leap and scream and do 1,000 forbidden things all at once. Aunt Kate, Dacia's mother, Ileana, and Lou's mother, Maria, had traveled to America from Romania as young women, and ended up staying when Ileana and Maria fell in love with two of New York's most eligible bachelors. They had not been back to Romania since, but all her life Dacia had heard stories about glorious Bucharest, with its elegant boulevards and magnificent homes. She had been taught Romanian from birth. She knew the country's history backward and forward, and she knew the details of each uncle and cousin still living there, even though she had met only a handful of them on their infrequent trips to New York. And now that she was in Bucharest at last, Aunt Kate seemed determined to keep Dacia away from it all. Dacia had practically been a prisoner for a week, and Aunt Kate would only give her a quelling look when she asked why. She knew why, but she wanted to make Aunt Kate say it aloud. If she was to be punished by being kept in a beautifully furnished prison, she wanted someone to have the humanity to tell her outright. Dacia was sure things would be better once Lou arrived with Uncle Cyrus and Aunt Maria, but she wasn't sure she could wait that long. So she had played her final card, dangerous as it was. The footman stepped out of the house to join her, and Dacia strolled forth at last. The weather was very fine. The streets were lined with beech trees, and giant lilac bushes bloomed in every garden. The purple flowers filled the air with scent, and Dacia drank it all in. She knew New York so well that none of it excited her anymore, and she had spent the last few months in London, which was like New York, only older and dirtier in her opinion. But Bucharest was magnificent, exotic without being off-putting, she decided. She recognized the French influence of the architecture, mixed in with some decidedly Eastern styles that pleased her a great deal, like houses painted bold colors, colonnades with striped and pointed arches, and exotic plants that stretched toward the sunlight. Dacia beamed at them and stretched herself, standing even taller. She had studied a map and a guidebook assiduously back at the house, so that she could make her way to the best shops without having to ask the footmen to lead her. They seemed almost nervous, and she could see them out of the corners of her eyes, scowling at anyone who dared to look at her. Was the city really that dangerous? She was not the only young woman out and about, and the streets were full of carriages bearing wealthy men and women who seemed not in the least bit anxious for their pearls. She herself wore only a small gold locket, and carried just enough money to buy some trinkets, so she was hardly a target for pickpockets, and even if she were robbed, it would be no great loss. Dacia glared over her shoulder at one of the footmen when he moved in too close, and that's when she knew they were being followed. Just as she had looked over her shoulder, someone behind them had moved a little too quickly for this lazy spring afternoon, though no one else seemed to notice. Telling herself that it was a silly fancy, she kept on going, but the feeling that they were being watched, that she in particular was being watched, would not leave her. It prickled down her back, little hot pinpoints beneath her dress. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, but the feeling persisted. She adjusted her parasol over her shoulder so that it concealed more of her, but still something was not right. The city began to feel less and less welcoming. The lines of the buildings were foreign, and she took a sudden dislike to the mixture of French and Eastern architecture. Couldn't they find their own style rather than copy from everyone else? There was a Rococo-fronted hotel just next to a restaurant with striped Byzantine arches over the doors, and she shook her head. She glared at a bank and, consequently, a banker coming down the stone steps, and he looked startled. When she saw a shop selling ribbons and lace, she let out a little huff of breath and almost ran to the door, telling the footman tersely to stay outside. In the dim coolness of the interior, she relaxed, and the shopkeeper had to ask her 3 times if he could help her before she came to herself. "Ah, yes." She remembered to speak Romanian. "I am looking for blue ribbons, dark blue, and perhaps something the color of the lilacs outside." The man smiled at her indulgently and agreed that the lilacs were very beautiful and very suited to her coloring as well. Dacia thanked him, though she knew that it was merely the empty flattery of someone trying to sell his wares. She was very tall and too slim for true beauty, and added to that she appeared to be the only woman in Bucharest who didn't have masses of beautiful dark hair. Her hair was blonde, with ashy streaks that she secretly contemplated dyeing some brighter shade. The shopkeeper brought out bolts of ribbons, but Dacia was distracted again. There was a scent in the air, not of dust and silk, but something else. It was familiar and strange at the same time. Dacia resisted the urge to raise her head and sniff, and focused on the shopkeeper and his wares. At last, Dacia selected wide, dark blue satin for Aunt Kate, who had bought a straw hat in London that Dacia thought needed some ribbon to make something really special out of it, and some narrower ribbon to go with her aunt's poplin walking gown. Then Dacia bought herself some lilac silk ribbons in different widths. As she was handing the man the correct amount of lei, the prickling returned. She turned her head slightly and saw a tall figure blocking the glass in the upper half of the shop door. She knew it was the person who had been following her before, knew it deeply and without a doubt. Thanking the shopkeeper, Dacia tucked the packet of ribbons firmly under her arm and stalked to the door. She whipped it open, staring up at the man on the step. He was taller than she was, with great broad shoulders that strained the seams of his dark coat, and offensively bright red hair. The footmen were just standing there like simpletons, so Dacia jabbed the tip of her parasol firmly into his breast. "Who are you, and why are you following me?" And why do you think I'm following you? Perhaps I am merely shopping for ribbons, like any young man on a fine day. Do you perhaps think too much of yourself, Miss Dacia of New York?" He spoke English, and he knew her name. Dacia squinted at him, and then she drew back and whacked him on the shoulder with her parasol as hard as she could. "Radu, you bad thing," she berated him. "Did you try to frighten me on purpose?" The young man laughed and blocked her next blow with his forearm. "Ouch! I'm a bad thing? You are a terrible cousin. You didn't even recognize me." "It's been 8 years since you visited New York," Dacia protested, "and none of your letters mentioned that you'd turned into a giant." She turned her face up to him. "You may kiss the royal cheek." Radu sighed and shook his head, but leaned down and kissed her on one cheek and then the other. Then he wrapped his arms around her and squeezed for good measure. The footmen pretended to look elsewhere, but the shopkeeper was staring out the window without shame. "Now you may take the royal arm and buy Her Highness lemonade," Dacia instructed. She unfurled her parasol and then waited, while Radu clutched at his heart and pretended to be honored beyond words. She finally slapped him lightly on the elbow, and he held it out for her. Radu was the only one of her Romanian cousins whom she had met. He had come with his father, Uncle Horia, to visit New York when Radu and Dacia were both 10. His father had called Dacia and Lou the Little Princesses, and it had become a game between the cousins. They had exchanged many letters over the years, from Their Highnesses to the lowly servant Radu, and from the humble Radu to the royal ladies. "Why haven't you come to see me before?" Dacia demanded, as Radu led her up the Calea Victoriae to a cafe. "I've been here for days and days, dying of boredom. Aunt Kate won't let me go anywhere, and we've not had one single visitor." "We've all been traveling," Radu said, looking around vaguely. "Traveling? Where?" "Nowhere important," he replied, but the tips of his ears were pink. "Just getting things ready for your visit. Ah, here's a good place. Radu, are you being evasive?" "I? Never." He seated her on the terrace of a cafe, and the footman sat down on a bench across the way, looking relieved to be in the shade, and to have turned over her care to Radu as well, Dacia thought, settling her bustled skirts carefully on the tiny cafe chair. She scowled at her cousin as he ordered them lemonade, and when he turned back from the waitress, he saw Dacia's expression with great surprise. He was clearly baffled by her dour look and the way she was impatiently tapping her gloved fingers on the tabletop. "Radu, I need to have one person here I can trust. Dacia said, very seriously now. What are you talking about? Whom can't you trust? You have Aunt Katerina, my father, the other cousins and uncles and aunts. He trailed off, fussing with his napkin. Radu. Dacia stopped and fiddled with her gloves while she put her thoughts in order. Radu, I know that you've probably heard about the incident in London. He snickered, indicating that he had, but wisely did not comment as she went on. But even before that, it seemed that Mother and Aunt Maria and Aunt Kate were keeping secrets. Lou and I were supposed to come later in the autumn and then go back to New York after Christmas. But suddenly we're being sent here now, months ahead of schedule, and not told when we will return to New York. They're behaving as though I did something truly disgraceful, when you know it wasn't that bad. Not bad enough to permanently ruin my reputation, anyway. I asked Aunt Kate if we could wait in Paris for Lou and her parents, Dacia went on, struggling to keep her voice under control now. But she insisted on coming around the coast as fast as we could travel. I thought she was simply eager for us to reach Bucharest. Yet now that we're here, as I've said, she won't leave the house, nor do we have any visitors. It's terribly strange, and I don't like it, Dacia finished. I need to have one person I can confide in, until Lou gets here at least, she frowned. And Lou is having a difficult time as well. In her last letter, she said that a strange young man approached her on the ship, and was very impertinent. She toyed with her gloves. In all honesty, I thought that's who you were just now, and I was prepared to have you arrested. Radu was clearly baffled by this last item. Someone being fresh with Lulu is hardly a crisis, Dacia, unfortunate as it is. Well, Dacia said, refusing to let this insult to her beloved Lou get tossed aside. He said some odd things to her, things that made her uneasy, and they're making me uneasy as well. It's a shame that Uncle Cyrus wasn't there to chase that cad away. Radu patted her hand. From now on, she'll be under the protection of her Florescu family, he said. She will not need to worry about anyone bothering her again. The waitress brought their lemonade, and Dacia sipped at hers. It was far too sweet, but she didn't really care. The day was really quite warm, and she didn't want Radu to see how discomfited she was by all that had happened, and most especially what he had just said, and the rude way he had dismissed Lou's father. Dacia worked very hard to appear like a sophisticated young woman, and it didn't help that she had outbursts of scandalous mischief that she couldn't seem to control, like the incident in London. She was hardly going to start weeping in an outdoor cafe because she'd had an emotionally trying day. Dacia, Radu said, once more covering her hand with one of his enormous paws, I promise you, no one is keeping you locked up to hurt you. We're merely planning many things. There is to be a big celebration for you and Lulu when she arrives, which is why I haven't been to see you. We were at the estate planning the celebration. But the family business has also suffered some upsets recently, and many of the uncles and older cousins are working on that. I'm very sorry that you feel neglected. He gave her a one-sided smile. The waitress nearly dropped her tray, and even Dacia found herself smiling back. Even with the impossible hair, Radu was quite the charmer, and he looked like he knew it too. The princess must never be neglected, he cried, so we must find a way to entertain her at once. What is your will, princess? He tried to bow despite the fact that he was sitting at a table, and knocked over his glass of lemonade. Dacia shrieked and jumped to her feet before the wave could reach her, throwing her napkin at it to try and stop its progress as it ran over the side of the little marble-topped table. Radu swore in Romanian, leaped up, knocked over his chair, and nearly unseated the man behind him, who also swore. Dacia started laughing helplessly. Radu turned bright red, handed far too much money to the waitress, and then hurried Dacia off the terrace and onto the street. Oh, my parasol! She started to run back. I'll buy you a new one, Radu said, still blushing. That parasol was a gift from Lou, Dacia said. Bring it to me right now, silly boy. Allow me, miss, said a smooth voice in perfect English. Dacia turned and saw the most handsome young man she had ever seen in her life. He was holding out her parasol and smiling at her. His teeth were white and perfect, and he had black eyes, lashes Dacia would have killed for, and curling dark hair that brushed the collar of his impeccably tailored Savile Row suit. He smelled like money and masculinity. The waitress on the other side of the little terrace fence was no longer looking at Radu, but gazing at the young man as though she were about to fall into a swoon, a reaction that Dacia understood completely. Dacia reached out a shaking hand and took her parasol from him. As she did, her fingers brushed against his. Despite the gloves they both wore, a charge of electricity ran through Dacia and she nearly did swoon. But, strangely enough, Radu growled, and the hair on the back of Dacia's neck stood on end. She was about to look at her cousin, sensing the tension radiating from him, but the beautiful young man laughed, and Dacia's whole attention returned to him. "What a pleasure to meet you at last, Miss Dacia," he said. "I am Prince Mihai, and I know precisely how to entertain you here in Bucharest." All right, next time we will learn more about the mysterious Prince Mihai, and we'll be hearing from Lou once more. Have a great weekend, and thanks for joining us. Bye!